Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. We will talk about Christianity in Southeast Asia. Last time we tried to explain some of the basics of Christianity, the origins. Christianity as a world religion, and also the religion centering around the life and teachings of Jesus. And we talk about some of the key branches of Christianity, that you can find around the world. And lastly, we talk about how Christianity was transmitted to Southeast Asia in the early times. Some of the encounters, the Spanish in parts of Southeast Asia, from in Malacca, Portuguese, for example, in Malacca, and you also had the Spanish in what later was called the Philippines. Also, you had some stories about conversion of Christianity or to Christianity in the eastern part of Indonesia. So let's continue on that. And let me share you my slides. So in this process of conversion to Christianity, you had the important role that the Holy Bible played as the written text. So remember, in Southeast Asia, many people were, illiterate, in the sense that they could not read nor write. They, especially in the hills, in the mountains, in the remote areas, isolated islands, right? These communities had not have texts unless if they already, had converted to one of the other world religions like Islam and Buddhism. So they already knew texts beforehand. But in what we call indigenous population, indigenous religious believers in parts of Southeast Asia, the Holy Bible was the first, text that they would be introduced to. That's why the missionaries try to convince these people that this text was superior to the oral tradition. So that's one aspect of this process of conversion, right? Through the text and introducing the text as something more, valuable and superior to the oral tradition. On the other hand, these missionaries, European missionaries, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and also later on the Americans and the French in Vietnam, for example, they had to study the local languages, the vernacular languages, the Tagalog, or in the Philippines, you have local languages, a number of many actually diverse local languages. And in part of Indonesia, you had to learn, different languages, Iban in Dayak language, for example, in part of Borneo, Kalimantan, different local languages that they had to study so that they can communicate to these people, right? So they needed to understand the local language, so that they could understand, communicate with the local peoples. And then they also need to translate the Bible, from, let's say, from English or French into these vernacular languages, right? So this is very interesting process of translation and study of local languages. So the local people themselves, they didn't have to learn English or French in order to understand the Bible, for example. They just received the teaching from these missionaries who already learned, gradually their local languages. So um, it is more responsibility on the part of the missionaries than the local people themselves, because the local themselves were the receiving agency, right? They just needed to learn the Bible in their own language or languages. All right. So this is very important point about the Bible, the place of the Bible in the process of conversion to Christianity in different parts of Southeast Asia. Education, for sure, has been, one of the main methods of transmission. It is through education that local people would be um, exposed to Christian beliefs and tradition. And some of these schools would become colleges. University of Santo Tomas, for example, uh, and Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines.
No sé.
All right. Would you please mute your Zooms? All right. Thank you. And then you also have some Christian uh, colleges in Java, especially since 1950s. So the earliest Christian, especially Catholic colleges would be in the Philippines by the Spanish. Then you also have the Jesuits in Indonesia, also building colleges. These are some of the names of these colleges, as well as in the Philippines, I already mentioned before. So anyway, this is just a list of names of the universities, because universities and colleges and schools really play a very important role in converting people into Christianity and making them even more, Christians, either Catholic or Protestant, according to the branches or denominations. That's education. And healthcare. So they build clinics. They build small, like hospitals where you had doctors, available for the local people. This is the list of some of the hospitals in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, in Indonesia, and different denominations built different hospitals. As you see here, from 16th century all the way to 20th century. And of course, today, in the present time, you still have these Christian hospitals across Southeast Asia. So that's another method of transmission of Christianity. Well, hospitals, serve as the place for them to to heal the sick and so on. So it's really interesting because using modern medicine, modern technology of medicine, would replace or add to the existing traditional ways of healing, right? Remember when we talk about shaman, right? Talk about the shaman, the medium between spirit world and humans. That they serve as the healer, right? Traditional healers, using some magical words and water and some rituals. So by introducing these hospitals, modern ways of healing, you will see some interesting either tension or coexistence. Modern Christian healing and then you have the traditional ways of healing. And this is one of the interesting, you know, uh, cases where the religious traditions and cultural traditions or local peoples might coexist, or one replace the other. It depends on, the context. So they would turn into one way or another, or some of them they resist it if they don't want to. They just keep the traditional ways of healing, and others just use both. So you go to the shaman and you go to hospitals to to see the doctor. So they just uh, accumulate the power to be healed, so that the more the better for them, right? So they can use both sources of the healing process. So anyway, so healthcare clinics, hospitals play a very important role in the process of Christianization in Southeast Asia. Not so much that they would convert the people into Christianity, but they offer the service, and maybe some of them would turn into the religions. Others just use and make use of this service, and then they keep their religious traditions. So there's different ways of interaction. So that doesn't mean that these hospitals serve as the missionary machine, that they are really try to convert the people into Christianity. But again, being Christian, also being helpful, and then providing the service that the people need regardless of the religious tradition. Other thing that I just want to make a list of it is social work. So apart from hospital, or you have care for women and children in different parts in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Agriculture aid programs, especially in the modern time. You have more and more humanitarian programs helping the people with, let's say, earthquakes, after the tsunami disasters, for example, natural disasters, volcanic eruptions, floodings, all kind of natural disasters. Many religious missions, including Christian missions, would come and then serve the people, and work in the humanitarian programs. And that goes to the present day. All right, so that's another dimension of this process of transformation by religious organizations and churches. So moving to localization, how the people now, right? So how the people themselves and these missionaries interacted in this very complex relationship. So localization, this is the concept that we use when we talk about different traditions, including Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam. How the people localize foreign terms, foreign concept, ideas, practices into their own worldviews and cultures, and or using their own worldviews in order to understand or appropriate foreign ideas. For example, dance, music, and images, which had been an integral part of the indigenous ritual. So they they had to also um, use or incorporate both foreign, Christian in this case, and indigenous at the same time. Let's say chanting the Ten Commandments and the Lord's Prayer that I already mentioned earlier, sermons in the vernacular, in the local language, following the Mass in Latin. So you have the Mass in Latin, right? Part of it is still in Latin, but then you had the other aspects of the ritual, like the Lord's Prayer and the sermon itself by the priests, by the missionaries in local languages. So you have the combination of foreign, in this case, scriptural language, ritual language, Latin, and the local language. The topics of this, some of them about immortality of the soul, the soul, the existence of God, the rewards for Christian in next life, and purgatory. So the purgatory is a very complex theological doctrine in Christianity. The place of perpetual pain. Basically, it's after someone die, and then before, the last time, before the end of time. So there's a intermediary, and purgatory is a place where you had this belief. Many aspects familiar in local culture, right? Like, for example, ritual feasting. Before the coming of Christianity, people already eat together. They had this communal feast, right? They eat food together during the harvest, uh, like weddings and funeral. They had this communal meal. Then you have communion, especially the Catholic ritual of Holy Communion. So they combine this, right? It's not a big deal for them to combine this because they already had this. They already known the notion of eating together, and now just to incorporate the new ideas of Catholic idea, Catholic ritual of the communion. The Eucharist that I also mentioned earlier had been understood now as a source of courage and a strength. So you have ethical teachings and ritual combined in this process of indigenization or localization. Just an example. So ritual is there, but in a local way, right? Another aspect of this localization is the use of water. So the use of water, again, water had been very important in many cultures, and including in animistic rites or rituals. The belief in the spirits that we already talked earlier. Remember, I used here animist here just for the sake of simplification. There is some discussion about whether or not we use the term, customary ritual or something, that the people themselves in the local context. Then you have baptism, right? But baptism, using water. Whether in a river, in a local river, or you had other ways of getting the water, and then use the water as a baptism. So baptism and animist rites don't necessarily contradict, so they just support each other. So the idea of water is, again, purifying the soul, curing the body and the soul. And then you have this recitation also of prayers side by side with this baptism in Latin. And others aspect of localization is the sign of the cross, as an alternative to the indigenous curing rites or healing rites. So before Christianity, the local peoples would just do the healing process traditionally. Now you had this prayers in Latin, the cross, and others rituals. Another, this is more, okay? So another examples of localization of Christianity in Southeast Asia is godparents, right? So you had now the baptized kids would have godparents, and so by having godparents, you had a new relationship, right? In the Philippines, compadre is a Spanish word, so you have a kinship relationship. So you are now connected and related in some ways, religiously and spiritually. The holy figures, right? The holy figures also very important. The names of Jesus and Virgin Mary, have been used in order to strengthen they already embedded local beliefs in spirit. So They already worship spirits, right? Ancestor spirits, spirits in in nature. Now you have new spirits coming, right? Through Christianity, the Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit, and Virgin Mary, and Jesus Himself. So you had this, combination of spirits, of course, in different meanings and for different meanings for different purposes. But for many people in the local time, in the local areas, in the Philippines and some areas of Indonesia, they don't see this as contradictions. So they continue they worship of spirits or animal, spirits or roh, for example, while they also embrace Christian figures, or holy figures. And in fact, practically speaking, some of these peoples use the cross, the Bibles, rosaries as talismans. Talismans is like, magical, powerful objects, right? The objects that can protect you, from any danger, or help you to, to live a healthy and prosperous life in everyday life. So in our talisman, you also now incorporate these new symbols and objects, like cross, and even the Bibles. Even just the pieces of the Bible, for example, used, and they would store the Bibles, maybe a small Bibles, and then they put it in the in their pockets, or they put it in their homes, or on the drawers of the cabinets. Not necessarily that they would read them, but they use these religious objects as talismans, as magical objects that can protect them from dangers, right? So that's just an example of localization, how people interpret Christianity into their own worldviews and cultures and practices. And this is one example, talisman. This doesn't mean that there is no compromise and tension between new ideas, new religious tradition, and local traditions, right? There's always tension. There was always compromise. Just an example here, I have a list of some of the compromises and tension, but also coexistent in other cases. For example, the Christian, especially the Catholic idea of monogamy. You can only marry one person, for example. While you have local people, especially the the local figures, not that they all, but you have a quite a number of polygamous relationship in the local context. So now, how would you negotiate between new ideas of monogamy and polygamous practice? So that's one case of tension that might also potentially occur. A divorce also another one. So that's another aspect of tension. That's one example. Another example, of course, I already mentioned dancing, singing, traditional games, right, that the people had before, festivals, parties, right? So local people already had this, and then you have um, new ways of doing things, rituals. Maybe for some of the missionaries, this singing, dancing are too profane, for example, too worldly. So they wanted to make sure that religious theme, religious message, ritual is also fulfilled. The purpose of ritual is fulfilled, not only about like any other dancing or any other singing, for example, any other games. So yeah, there's some potential tension between new practice and old practices. Another thing is about theology, right? About belief, right? I already mentioned about spirits. So you have the notion of God, the notion of Holy Ghost, the Trinity, new ideas about grace, God grace, a new idea about sin, hell, and others, they wanted to, the missionaries wanted to change these ideas of spirits, local spirits, worship of local spirits, so anito in some places they are called. So the idea of Holy Ghost, grace, sin, hell, and others now had to be understood and interpreted in a way that might not necessarily um, accommodate too much of the local spirit. In other words, some of the local spirit, some of the worships of the local spirit have to minimize, if not eradicated, if not gone, uh, so that new ideas, new holy figures, uh, really, um, complete, not partial, are complete and not partial. But again, this tension might not necessarily always occur because, again, as I mentioned earlier, new ideas and local ideas might just coexist, and then they have the different understandings. You just need to talk about which community in which time, under which rulership, under which churches, where and when, and you can discuss this. Some of the articles and chapters that I post on Island talks about this, right? The relationship between Christianity and indigenous beliefs, right? So you can see, more examples and cases there in the readings. All right. So again, despite the efforts, old beliefs remain. This term glocalization, I might be new, to some of you, but maybe not. Glocalization, from globalization and localization combined. So globalization and localization. Why this term? This is a term that one of our authors, Professor Barbara Andaya, used in order to describe this process of Christianization and indigenization as simultaneous and entwining process, like a simultaneous process, Christianization and then localization as entwining process, as simultaneous process. They don't necessarily two different processes. It's one process of Christianization, making them Christian, but also making Christianity local. That's why the term localization. You might agree or disagree with this term, but it is useful for some who don't have an alternative term for describing this simultaneous entwining process, right? You might use this localization also when we talk about Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, not only about Christianity. In other words, how Protestantism, coming from different times and areas and regions, Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, implanted, but also practiced in the context of the Filipino, Indonesian, and other local cultures. That localization, yeah, it might be useful for some of you who want to use the term, for describing making something worldly, universal, and making something universal, local, indigenous at the same time, right? I like to use another illustration about localization. I don't want you to just an example. This is maybe very banal or very mundane example, which is McDonald's, right? So McDonald's, let's say it's from America, right? McDonald's from America. So now you have in Jakarta or in Bali or in Manila or in Cebu or in Bangkok. In Indonesia, where you have rice, so McDonald's has to provide rice. Yeah, so you have sandwich and chicken and stuff and beef, right? But you also have rice. Just an example. So you have the localization, rice and McDonald's. Here you have mashed potatoes, for example. That's an example, right? Localization. Think about that. Certain elements of different religious tradition and cultures blended into one simultaneously. All right. Um, I just want to check if there is some question. Let me see. All right. Yeah. All right. Let's move on. Um, oops. All right. So let's talk about reasons for conversion. Some of the reasons why people converted to Christianity. It is very, the answer is diverse and complex. So there is no one reason, probably more than one reasons why people convert to Christianity, why they move from the indigenous tradition to new religion, world religion called Christianity, either in the forms of the particular denominations, or Roman Catholic Church. So you have one is that they want to be modern. They want it to be modern. They want to be part of this progress kind of thing, like development. By converting to Christianity, they become part of the world community. Being Christian, it's a world religion, and through schools that they now had and attended, and clinics that provided, and access to offices, administration, and you have the priests, all this organization. So for them, for these indigenous populations, it is becoming a sign of being modern, right? That's one. Second, maybe economic reason, a practical reason to improve this welfare, and there's some cases where people, when they are asked why you convert to Christianity, why don't just stick with your spirit worship and rituals, and they reply, it is very expensive to feed the spirits every year, for example. I just an example. Feeding spirits is costly. So there's that kind of motive and practical motive. A political reason might be also, that they now are in lines with either a new ruler who had converted to Christianity. So they see more power there politically. And then, of course, spiritual and religious reasons. And this is very important for sure. The crisis of order. Maybe they are poor, maybe they are illiterate, they are sick, they need more power to heal the sick. They wanted to be educated to get some knowledge, more knowledge, and they are poor, So that's the crisis of order that they faced. And then you had the Christian missionaries coming to them and providing the answer to this crisis. So in a way, it's a problem-solving thing. So world religion also serves as a problem solver, right, for many peoples who are in need and in crisis. So spiritually and religiously, as one of the main reasons why they have converted. These reasons do not necessarily, like exclusive to against each other. They might combine, they might exist at the same time, or one time is stronger here, in other cases is stronger this dimension. So it's just a way of understanding why peoples have converted to Christianity, while they also keep some aspects of their old traditions and religious traditions included. Being modern, economically less costly, more powerful, religiously more assuring, and rewarding spiritually, right? So that's some of the reasons for conversion. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about some of the Christian denomination in Southeast Asia. I just give you here a list of them. I don't go into too many details about the contents of each of these denominations. You can I can give you some sources. What are the differences between this denomination, especially among the Protestant denomination that are in Southeast Asia. I have here some some basic information. The Anglican London Missionary Society, 18th century England, they aim to enable such a mission overseas. So it's very important. A mission of a British mission, especially in Malaysia, in the British colony, right? And then the English Methodists also from England, 18th century. So the denomination really focus on free will through God's grace. The notion of God, the grace of God, and also emphasizing personal and social piety. And they hold annual covenant service. And of course, there are some other aspect of the English Methodists. Baptists, it's basically centering around baptism. It is salvation through faith alone, scripture alone, the autonomy of the local church, individual soul liberty, and the emphasis of separation of church and state. So these are some of the characteristics of the Baptist. Of course, you have discussion and variation in this, just to give you, a broad perspective what Baptists actually are doing and teaching and preaching in Southeast Asia. American churches, of course, play a very important role in especially after post-independence time. In the Philippines, toward the 20th century to the present day, in Southeast in Indonesia, you had from late 19th century, 20th century until today, Presbyterians, Methodists, Seventh-day Adventists, Assemblies of God, Salvation Army, Southern Baptists, Lutherans, Episcopalians, and so on. One of them is some Assembly of God. It's important in Singapore and Vietnam and others. The Bible as the rule for faith and conduct, baptism in the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues. So the speaking in tongues is a characteristic of Assembly of God. Basically, you pray and you sing, you pray, and oftentimes loudly. So it's part of the ritual, and it's very important part of the members of the service. Speaking in tongues, just an example. Salvation Army is also quite important in Indonesia. I know in the Philippines, in Singapore. Coming from England, they emphasize the help on the poor and the hungry, right? There's really very devotion to helping the poor and the needy, the immortality of the soul, and the resurrection of the body. So the body, and not only the soul that will be resurrected, but also the body. Resurrection of the body is one of the doctrines of the Salvation Army. They also competed with each other, right? The colonial powers sometimes, like the Dutch and the British and the French, especially the Dutch and the British, they try to give different religious denomination to different areas, so they don't conflict or they don't compete. They don't work in the same area, so that they might have conflicts between these different churches. But at the same time, of course, they compete. They try to win the hearts and the minds of the local peoples. Remember, many of these local areas in Southeast Asia, you have already predominantly Buddhists in the mainland Southeast Asia, and in Indonesia, many of these areas already had already become Islamic. So the colonial power tried to avoid tension and conflicts. So that's why the colonial powers like the Dutch, allowed these missions in places where you don't have Muslims very strong. So you had, um, they tried to uh, encourage, or aid the Christian mission in remote areas, in the local indigenous peoples who had not become a Muslim, for example. That's why you had the success of Christianity in many of the islands is thanks to these non-religious, non-Islamic communities. You do have, however, Muslims who later on converted to Christian denominations, as well as also you have Christian who later on converted to Islam and so on in some areas and cases. All right, so competition and collaboration are there between these religious denominations. In the Philippines, to go back to Philippines, where we maybe, need to talk more about the Philippines. This is the only Asian country where you have predominantly Christian, and then is Timor or Timor-Leste. So that's the second, predominantly Christian country in Southeast Asia. The youngest country, Timor-Leste, uh, which was independent of Indonesia, uh, and colonized by the Portuguese. That's why it's Catholic. But you have the Philippines already Christianized by the Spanish and later on by the American. So the first Spanish conqueror, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, 16th century. Then you had other denomination, including Jesuit and Dominicans. So they try to, do the mission in these areas, mostly peacefully, predominantly peacefully. In some cases, they had to use the force because they had some resistance by especially some Muslim local figures there in the Philippines. Opposition against Spanish American colonialism from 1892 to 1946. So now you had the introduction of Protestantism, especially Presbyterians and Methodists. That's not really successful because you already had a few hundred years of Spanish Catholic culture and institution intact in the Philippines. But still, you do have the process of conversion to Protestantism in the Philippines. And one aspect of the changes that the Americans, Christians introduced to the Philippines is the separation of church and state. Why? Because the Spanish concepts of politics was that it was integration. So the church and the state were one. Like in Spanish, the church and really was supported by the state, or the state supported the church. Is just, in some cases, it is just one integral institution. Of course, different peoples, but integration, integral institution. So that's why they were quite successful, because the crown helped supported the mission in the Philippines. So the Americans came introducing separation of church and state. So now you have the churches in charge of themselves, and the state in most ways had to be neutral, or at least they don't now take care of the church and the churches, right? So it's very interesting change, a shift from Catholic ways of doing things to Protestant ways of doing administration, especially in the Philippines. All right, I believe I need some water. So far, so good. Let's see if there is some questions. If I can answer, let's see. Okay. All right, let's move on. Okay. The church reformation under Philip II. This is again history. Uh, I already talked way later. I'm sorry, but this is still Spanish Catholic impact in the Philippines. 16th century, so they tried to standardize, reorganize, and increase emphasis on the Passion of Christ. Um, the Passion of Christ, it's a story to it's a Latin word, passio, to suffer, to endure, right? So the suffering of Jesus is really enacted in a ritual, in the doctrine. It's very important. The Passion of Christ later on was used by some of the revolutionaries in the Philippines to actually fight against the Spanish. I don't know if I have slides about that, but the point is, the Spanish Christian missionaries, Catholic missionaries, they taught the Passion of Christ, uh, but then the people used the Passion of Christ in order to fight against them. Uh, at the time of revolution against. But again, I do have some literature about this, very fascinating literature about this. How religious tradition, how religious symbols, right, was used by missionaries, and then also incorporated, appropriated by the people in order to resist against the Spanish.
So, Dr. Ali, does that mean that was Catholicism in the Philippines viewed as a colonial institution or not?
Very good point. So it is so embedded, culturally, institutionally, educationally, right, politically, that they don't really have this notion of Catholicism as a colonial, necessarily, as like two separate, right, two separate institution, like colonial and Catholic leaders, for example, in the church. They don't really have this separation, right? But then when there's some cases where there's some tension, especially later on, some resistance against Americans also later on. Although they saw, especially among some educated, by the name, what's the name again? Why do I forget the name? Um, um, One of the revolutionary, he was Christian, he was Catholic, but he saw Spanish culture also as a colonial, colonial power. So you do have late 19th century, yeah, that's a late 19th century where some of them started to see this encroachment of culture, and especially the economy, especially tax burden against them, right? So there's some grievances, yeah, there's some grievances among the local people. They already Catholicized, but then it's gradually these grievances rising, and then they demonstrate against them. That's why they supported Americans in the early time. They supported American coming as like helping them, right? They like heroes for them that try to liberate them from this Spanish colonial power. But that didn't happen until late 19th century. Okay, it's quite complex. So it really depends on who and when, right? And in what context. There's a book about that, but I can show you the book. One book, just one book only, and it's about that, about the use of the Passion of Christ in resisting the Spanish, and also especially the Spanish in the later time. Okay. All right, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you.
Society of Jesus also, this is one of Jesuit is very strong institution, financially, organizationally. They really are very serious in religious teaching, and really critical against Protestantism, and also quite, very a strong effort in proselytizing non-Christians, especially the indigenous populations. So there's some tension, of course, between Jesuit and Protestant denomination and Jesuit and local tradition. But again, doesn't mean that it's always tension. The Society of Jesus also plays a role in making sure that things are as gradually as possible, as locally as being accepted by the people, using the translation of the Bible into local languages, and so on and so forth. So you have that. All right. So the Spanish heritage in the Philippines, yeah. Um, I have here in the slide. Sean already asked about this. Religious nationalism, right? Religious nationalism, Filipino being Catholic, Catholic being Filipino. So as I mentioned earlier, politically, socially, culturally is very, very Spanish. Uh, Even the name itself, the Philippines, right? The Philippines from King Philip's. But anyway, um, you now have a middle class, right? The educated, right? The educated intelligentsia, and these ilustrados now are aware about they being local, being indigenous, being native, right? This now they understand now that these Spanish are actually foreigners, and you have this grievances, and especially after uh, uh, late 19th century, 1872. There's some executions of 3 Filipino priests by the Spanish political powers, and this creates tension, and that's why the one of the factors why there was some protests and revolution against the Spanish in the late 19th century. Catholics 82%, Protestant 5%, Muslims 4.6%. You have independent churches and others. Just 2005 to give you a sense of how now Philippines in terms of the religious traditions. Catholics are still majority, and then you have the Protestants, and you have Muslims. This is the one that I mentioned, Catholicism and Filipino independence, passion, right? From the Passion of Christ and Revolution, 1840, 1920, against Spanish and for independence. The term that they use is kalayaan, liberty, freedom. Kalayaan is freedom, or fighting for freedom. Katipunan is gathering together, like groups, organizations. Utang na loob, inner death, death of gratitude. So the passion now used by these revolutionaries, in order to again to resist or resist the colonial power, the hardship that they endure and they suffer from, and now we have like the hardship of Christ. So the suffering of Christ now interpreted in light of the suffering of the peoples being colonized by the Spanish. The Spanish who told them about religion, but at the same time also who control them in so many domains of life. So that's a really interesting, tension. Churches in the Philippines. All right. So there's some just the list of the churches, right? I give you this to just give you a sense of so many churches in the Philippines. National Council of Churches in the Philippines. This is for it's like an umbrella organization. So for all the churches in the Philippines, you have National Council of Churches, Philippine Council of Evangelical Churches, Philippines for Jesus Movement, Christian Conference of Asia, and of course the World Council of Churches has a branch and on office in the Philippines, just to give you a list of the names. All right. Apart from the mainstream churches, right? The mainstream churches, you have also the churches of the people, independent churches. In other words, they are not so much part of the official or establishment. They self-determine the structures and the governance. But again, they also become more and more local or indigenous because they are. This is the one that are more, you know, maybe less critical of local spirit beliefs, like the beliefs in the supernatural, miraculous healing, and others. So that's, so that's again the localization, localization in this Church of the People. The Jesus Miracle Crusade International Ministry focus on healing, familial problems, real problems they wanted to take care or solve or deal with. So that's just one of the independent churches. And one of the books talks about marginal but popular churches. The Church of Jesus Christ, Iglesia Ni Cristo, 1914, which now has more than 6 million adherents. Interestingly, they are non-Trinitarian, and then they believe in the last messenger of God, Felix Manalo. So it's considered marginal because it's not part of the mainstream denomination that we talked about earlier. They had a new idea, maybe we can call like the new religious movement, right? Out of the, of course, after Christianity, and then you also have Latter-day Saints or Mormon Church also playing some mission role in the Philippines, and of course the Jehovah's Witnesses also in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Singapore, in Malaysia. Jehovah's Witnesses, small or but quite significant, and I would say enthusiast in the making people aware of Jesus, and especially Jehovah, the notion of Jehovah. All right, the role of independent churches. So they emphasize charismatic teachings, local priests and pastors instead of foreign priests and pastors. They have their own localized priests and pastors. They use contemporary music and media technologies. Again, the notion of localization, contextualization, indigenization, right? That we already talked about. So independent churches, then you have marginal churches, you have mainstream churches in the Philippines. To make it even more political for this, we can discuss a little bit about, let me check the time. All right, we have 15 minutes, right? Churches as political spaces. All right, so under under the ruling party, martial law. What is the president again? Why do I forget again his name? Philippine president. Oh my! So he had this martial law. Okay, he has the martial law, and churches also serve as a political space, either supporting or assisting, political establishments. I'm trying to find Ferdinand Marcos. Why do I forget the name? Marcos, right? So during the Marcos time, under him is martial law. Martial law means that you cannot go out in the evening, and because of the resistance by the people. And also you have people's power later on, people power. So Christianity was used in order to, to fulfill these grievances against political establishment. That's the point. It's very detailed studies about this, as well as politically. So politics and Christianity in the Philippines. There's some literature about that, but also humanitarian works. That's for sure. Christian missions also play a role in the humanitarian works. You know that Philippines and Indonesia are also earthquakes, some epicenters in this, because it's islands, archipelagos, right? So religions play a major role in serving the people, and providing the people a space for anxiety, the uh, all kind of problems due to on the aftermath of the natural disasters. So natural disaster in Southeast Asia, in a way, provide peoples more religious. In a way, religion provide them space, an answer today. Why is this natural disasters happening to them? And some are more scientific, and others are, finding the answer in God, or in the power of the supernatural, and so on. But anyway, uh, uh, humanitarian works are very important in Southeast Asia, and Christianity is one of the religions that's really, has been doing so much to this purpose. Challenges, relationship with Muslims, especially in Indonesia, in Malaysia, okay, in part of the Philippines, because in the Philippines you have now most Muslims now live in the southern part, in Mindanao, in the Sulu areas. So before, you had this tension between the Spanish and the Muslim rulers, Muslim local rulers, and later on, under the Catholic, or under the post-colonial governments, we try to they try to accommodate Muslim aspirations, and but still there's some tensions in the Philippines between Christians, and Muslims. And of course, class distinction, class problems, rich, poor divide, corruption of the governments also create some challenges for the churches, infrastructure, education, and so on and so forth. Access, equal access to education for people who don't have enough, means to get education. So some of these religious schools and colleges give scholarships to those people who don't have enough support, financial support. But at the same time, education also make uh, people more aware about the religions of the religions that these organizations uh, are attached to, or are connected to, either Christian schools or Muslim schools or Buddhist schools in the mainland Southeast Asia. Catholicism and Filipino culture. This is just, again, when we talk about religion and culture. Then you have arts and literature, music, dance, paintings, architectures, a lot that you can write about, influenced by religion. Um, and that's something that you can talk about, religion and culture, like in the Philippines. This is another thing that I already talked a little bit before, right? And the language, Filipino language with Christian words. Yeah, so in other words, many Christian words now become local language, local usage: Passion, Misa, Baptismo, Ama Namin, Banal na Sacrificio, Sacramento, communion, as for communion. So Christian language or symbols become local terms, local vocabularies. So one of the impacts of religion in Southeast Asia is language. Okay, Sanskrit, right, plays a role in Southeast Asia. Sanskrit words are everywhere in Southeast Asia, and also Arabic words also in Southeast Asia. Now we have Spanish and English terms also in Southeast Asia. So religions play a role in this process of language formation. All right, I should stop, I think, here, because we're gonna move to Christianity in Indonesia next week, and also some areas like Christian in Thailand and Burma. So we'll talk more about that next week. The last lecture on Christianity. Okay. All right. It's still 5 minutes left, but if you, so I don't, give you too much for today. So we will talk on Christianity in Indonesia and other countries next week, the last day of for Christianity. I'm still working on your critical analysis essays. Okay, stay. Just wait for my feedback. All right. And let's see if you have any question here. How about exam? All right. Oh, yeah. Exam, the midterm exam, right? I should have sent you yesterday. I have to revise the questions as soon as possible. Okay. I will see if I will see the deadline. So I will give you more time if I have to extend the time. But I'll see first. I will see the deadline for your midterm exam. I'll give you questions to answer, either 5, or I will figure it out. All right. Thank you for the reminder about the exam. In the meantime, you can submit your 5 weekly essays if you want.
4 weekly essays, Professor.
Yeah?
4 weekly essays?
Yes, 4. Yeah, 4. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. So the take home exam again, I'm sorry I haven't I haven't posted yet, but I will do as soon as possible, and I will see the due date if I have to extend for the midterm. It depends on how much time that I think that you need to answer the question. Okay, I'll just wait wait for my email and announcement. Okay, for the midterm exam. All right. Thank you so much again for joining the meeting, and thank you for the question, Sean, and others as well on your chat. If you haven't done, say you are here, attendance, yeah, you can certainly do so. Again, stay safe and healthy. Another question here: is the exam going to be from the readings or lecture? All right. Mostly from the readings. So I might point you to which readings. I might. Okay. So for one, question number 1, the readings that you will need to read in order to answer the question. Okay. I will. That's why I need to revise the the questions and see what. All right. If I can just point you to which readings to answer the question, so you don't have to, like browse the whole readings in order to answer one question or something. Sounds good? All right. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Professor, and good night.
Good night. Yep. Good night, everyone.